My name is Grace Bennett, and until the week of my wedding, my future mother-in-law believed I was nothing more than a schoolteacher who had somehow tricked her son into loving me. She never said it directly, not in front of witnesses anyway, but every glance she gave me across the dinner table carried the same message. I was not enough. I did not come from the right family, I did not have the right last name, and in her mind, I certainly did not belong standing next to her son at the altar of the venue she considered practically sacred ground, the Ashford Manor, a sprawling estate outside Charleston that had hosted 3 generations of her family's weddings. I met Daniel Carter during my second year of teaching third grade in a small town outside Savannah. He was kind in a way that felt unforced, the kind of man who remembered the names of my students because I mentioned them once in passing. He used to drive 40 minutes after his own workday just to help me grade spelling tests at my kitchen table, claiming he enjoyed it, though I suspect he simply enjoyed being near me. On weekends, he would show up with coffee and sit quietly grading papers alongside me, never once complaining about the mess of red pens and crumpled worksheets that took over my kitchen table every Sunday. We fell in love slowly, and then all at once, the way people always describe it but rarely mean. When he proposed on a pier overlooking the marsh at sunset, I said yes before he even finished the question. I did not think about his mother in that moment. I should have known better. Margaret Carter had built her identity around appearances. She served on the boards of charities that mostly seemed to exist so she could host luncheons, and she measured people by their zip codes, their maiden names, and the schools their children attended. When Daniel brought me home for the first time, she shook my hand with the enthusiasm of someone touching a doorknob in a public restroom. She asked me where I went to college, and when I told her, she smiled the way people smile when they are disappointed but trying to be polite about it. She asked what my father did for work, and when I explained he had been a high school football coach for 30 years, she nodded slowly and changed the subject to a cousin who had just been accepted into a prestigious law program. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table that night, a small gesture of solidarity that I clung to on the long drive home. Over the following months, I noticed how carefully Margaret curated every gathering our families attended together. At Thanksgiving, she seated me at the far end of the table beside a second cousin who spent the entire meal discussing his boat. At Daniel's sister's birthday dinner, Margaret introduced me to her friends as Daniel's companion rather than his fiancé, a slip she later claimed was accidental, though she made the same accidental slip 3 more times that evening. I mentioned it to Daniel once, gently, not wanting to seem petty, and he assured me his mother simply needed time to adjust. I wanted to believe him, so I did, for longer than I probably should have. For 2 years, I endured small cruelties disguised as concern. Margaret would mention, always so casually, that Daniel had dated a surgeon before me, or that a family friend's daughter had just married into old money down in Charleston. She never insulted me outright. She was too careful for that. Instead, she chipped away, comment by comment, the way water wears down stone, until I began to wonder if she might be right about me. There were nights I cried quietly in the bathroom after family dinners, wondering whether I truly belonged in Daniel's world, before reminding myself that Daniel had chosen me precisely because of who I was, not despite it. What Margaret did not know, what nobody in the Carter family knew, was that 7 years before I ever met Daniel, my grandmother left me a modest inheritance when she passed away. I used part of it, along with savings from tutoring on weekends and summers, to make a quiet investment in a struggling historic property outside Charleston. The estate was falling apart at the time, gutters hanging loose, gardens overgrown, barely surviving on a handful of bookings a year. I partnered with a small group of investors to restore it, and over time, it became one of the most sought-after wedding venues in the state. I never used my married name for any of it, since I was not married yet, and I filed everything under my maiden name, Grace Ellison, through a private holding company. Daniel knew I had some investments. He did not know which ones, because I never saw the need to advertise it, and frankly, I liked having something that was entirely my own. There was a particular satisfaction in those early years of ownership that I rarely spoke about, even to Daniel. I remember driving out to the property for the first time, seeing the sagging porch columns and the weeds pushing up through the old stone walkways, and feeling something stir in me that had nothing to do with money. My grandmother had always told me that broken things deserved patience, not judgment, and I suppose some part of me saw myself in that crumbling estate. I spent weekends away from teaching, meeting with contractors and landscapers, poring over restoration plans late into the night. Watching the gardens bloom again, watching the manor's grand staircase gleam under fresh varnish, gave me a quiet confidence that no amount of Margaret's disapproval could touch. The venue we chose for our wedding was, of course, the Ashford Manor. Margaret picked it before Daniel and I had even finished discussing our guest list. She informed us, rather than asked us, that she had already spoken to the events coordinator and secured the date. I found it almost funny at the time, since the Ashford Manor was the very property I had helped rescue from foreclosure years earlier. Margaret had no idea that the woman she considered so far beneath her family actually held a significant ownership stake in the building where she planned to show off her son's wedding to all her friends. I remember biting back a smile when she announced it at dinner, proud of herself for choosing what she believed was the most impressive venue in the state, unaware she had unknowingly chosen mine. The trouble started 3 weeks before the wedding, when Margaret decided that my seating chart, my flower arrangements, and even my choice of string quartet were not sophisticated enough for her social circle. She began making changes without asking me, first small ones, then increasingly bold ones, until Daniel finally told her she needed to step back. Margaret did not take that well. She smiled through gritted teeth and said, of course, whatever we wanted, but I recognized that tone. It was the tone of a woman who had no intention of backing down and was simply regrouping. That same week, she began dropping comments about how important it was for a wedding to reflect the values of the families involved, comments I now understand were the opening notes of a plan already taking shape in her mind. 5 days before the wedding, I received a call from the events coordinator, a woman named Patricia who had worked at the Ashford Manor for over a decade. She sounded nervous, apologizing repeatedly before explaining that our booking had been flagged for cancellation due to a noise complaint filed by a neighboring property owner. She said corporate had received a call about excessive disturbances during our rehearsal dinner setup, even though we had not even begun setup yet. Patricia sounded confused herself, saying she had never seen a complaint filed this far in advance of an event actually taking place. My hands were shaking slightly by the time I hung up the phone, though not from fear so much as a slow, dawning suspicion. I felt my stomach drop, not because I was afraid of losing the venue, but because I recognized the timing immediately. Margaret had mentioned, almost gloatingly, at a family dinner the week before, that she had a close friend on the county zoning board and another friend who golfed regularly with someone on the venue's ownership team. I remember Daniel laughing it off at the time, thinking his mother was simply name-dropping to feel important. I did not laugh. I quietly excused myself from the dinner table and made a phone call of my own. I called James Calloway, the general manager who reported directly to our holding company, a man I had worked closely with for 6 years. I asked him plainly whether anyone outside the normal channels had contacted him about a noise complaint or a request to cancel a booking under the name Carter. There was a long pause before he answered. He said that yes. In fact, a woman had come by the property in person 2 days earlier, introduced herself as the mother of the groom, and suggested rather forcefully that the booking be reviewed due to what she called concerns about the appropriateness of the couple for the venue's reputation. She had even offered, according to James, to make a generous personal donation to the venue's restoration fund if the date could somehow become unavailable. I sat with that information for a long moment, feeling something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, but a quiet, steady resolve. I thanked James and asked him to do nothing further until I called him back. I did not tell Daniel yet. I wanted to handle this my way, calmly, with proof in hand rather than accusations flying across a dinner table. That night, I lay awake beside Daniel, watching the ceiling fan turn slowly overhead, rehearsing in my mind exactly how I would handle his mother without ever raising my voice. The rehearsal dinner took place 2 nights before the wedding at a private room inside the Ashford Manor itself, ironically enough. Margaret had arranged the seating chart herself, of course, placing herself at the head of the table like the matriarch she believed herself to be. Throughout dinner, she made pointed remarks about how weddings sometimes fall apart at the last minute, how important it is to have contingency plans, how she had heard from a friend that certain venues can be unreliable when it comes to honoring bookings. Daniel kept apologizing to me under his breath, clearly embarrassed, having no idea his mother was not simply being dramatic but actively narrating her own sabotage in real time. When dessert arrived, I asked Patricia, who was overseeing our dinner personally, if she would not mind bringing James Calloway in for a moment, explaining that I wanted to thank him for accommodating some last-minute changes to our contract. Margaret's eyes flicked toward me sharply at the mention of the word contract, though she said nothing. James arrived a few minutes later, dressed in a suit rather than his usual polo shirt, carrying a leather folder under his arm. He greeted the table warmly, then turned to me and asked whether I wanted to discuss the amendment to the holding agreement now or after the wedding. I said now would be perfect, actually, since we had a wonderful audience already gathered. I explained calmly, without raising my voice, that I had recently decided to formalize something I had kept quiet for years, that I was updating the ownership records for the Ashford Manors Holding Company to reflect my married name going forward. Margaret's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Daniel turned to look at me, his expression somewhere between confusion and dawning realization. I continued, explaining to the table that I had been a silent investor in the venue since it was practically a ruin, that I had personally overseen its restoration, and that any decisions regarding bookings, complaints, or cancellations ultimately crossed my desk before anyone else's. Margaret's face went through several colors in quick succession. She tried to laugh it off, saying something about how delightful it was that I dabbled in real estate, but her voice had lost its usual confidence. I looked directly at her and said, gently but firmly, that I understood a noise complaint had been filed against our own rehearsal dinner before it even happened, and that I found it curious given that the person who filed it apparently also offered a donation in exchange for our cancellation. The table went completely silent. Daniel's father set down his glass. Daniel himself turned to his mother and asked, in a voice I had never heard him use before, whether that was true. Margaret did not answer right away. She looked at me, then at her son, then back at me, clearly calculating whether denial was still an option. James, to his credit, simply confirmed the timeline factually, without editorializing, stating that the complaint had indeed originated from a woman matching her description who had visited the property in person. There was no need for me to say another word. The facts spoke clearly enough on their own, laid out calmly in front of everyone who mattered. Daniel's sister lowered her eyes to her plate. Daniel's father cleared his throat and said nothing at all, which somehow felt like the loudest response of the evening. Daniel apologized to me repeatedly that night, though I told him he had nothing to apologize for. What mattered more to me was watching him stand up, quietly but firmly, and tell his mother that regardless of her feelings about our relationship, she would never again attempt to interfere with our lives behind our backs. Margaret left the dinner early, citing a headache, though everyone at the table understood the real reason. Patricia walked her to her car herself, and later told me privately that Margaret had not said a single word the entire walk. Our wedding took place 2 days later exactly as planned, in the same gardens I had helped restore years before anyone in the Carter family knew my name. The late afternoon light settled gold over the lawn, and the roses I had planted years earlier were in full bloom, as though the estate itself understood the significance of the day. Margaret attended, sitting quietly in the second row rather than the front, having lost the seat of honor she assumed was hers by default. She said very little to me that day, though she did approach me briefly near the end of the reception, her voice noticeably smaller than usual, to say that she had underestimated me. I told her simply that I hoped, moving forward, she would give herself the chance to actually know me rather than assume who I was based on where I came from. Daniel and I danced late into the evening beneath string lights we had chosen ourselves, surrounded by people who had come to celebrate rather than judge. My father gave a toast that made half the room cry, recalling how he used to watch me study late at night, determined to build something of my own someday. Daniel held my hand through all of it, steady and certain, as though nothing that had happened over the previous 2 years had shaken his faith in us for even a moment. Daniel and I have been married for 2 years now. Margaret and I are not close, though our relationship has softened into something civil, occasionally even warm, especially since the birth of our daughter last spring. She visits sometimes, and I notice she chooses her words far more carefully these days, often catching herself mid-sentence and softening whatever comment she was about to make. As for the Ashford Manor, it has hosted nearly 200 weddings since ours, and I still walk its gardens every few months, checking on the roses we planted the year I first invested everything I had into a broken-down property that everyone else had given up on. The same way, in a strange sort of way, I once felt about myself.